and do that. So the recording started. And okay. So like I was saying, the dialogue format is an experimentation. And just give you a short brief of the format. We are going to have a short icebreaker session for people to introduce themselves with an icebreaker question. I think Richard is going to bring one for that today as well. And then we will start out with a short introduction of the topic, or whatever the topic might be. We will build the topic. We'll have 3 breakout sessions of 20 minutes each. So after initially introducing the topic, there will be a discussion question on what to discuss in the breakout. And then we will break out for 20 minutes around that questions. We'll regroup to review what we did in the breakouts and what we integrated from that, from the synthesis of the conversations that happens there. We will continue with Dr. Richard on introducing the topic for about 5 to 8 minutes. Beyond that, there would be a second breakout of 20 minutes or around that time. And then we would repeat it a third time before we wrap up for the end of the day. So that's the kind of format, deep dialogue discussions within small groups to integrate and have conversations around the subject. And then we are hoping that there would be some form of learning synthesis from that. Only one expectation is, at least for the breakout, highly recommended that you use your webcams. You'll be in small groups of 3 or 4. So having close conversations would be more ideal with your webcams on in order to do that. So with that, I would just give a quick introduction to Richard. Of course, Richard here is today from Hong Kong. He is the Chief Cognitive Officer of EQ Labs, and I have been attending EQ Lab meetups for nearly about 10 or 12 weeks now, about 20 sessions. They do run about 2 a week. I got hooked by the format that Richard does there, and I said, okay, if you got to copy something, here is something that you would copy. And I brought in Dr. Richard here today to start us out on how to do it. So it's an experiment we are conducting, and we hope to build on top of this format in the future. With that, I turn you over to Dr. Richard, who is taking some time. It is this early morning there in Hong Kong. He's on the other side of the globe. And so over to you, Dr. Richard.
It's not that early compared to the time you and Becky get up to come to my sessions. It's 7:30 here. You guys get up at 5:30, so 5 o'clock for a 5:30 start, which is I don't think it's just spectacular that you do that. So yeah, an opening thing really is just a breakout question. So Nina, who I think is in charge of the tech, will break us out into groups of 2. For about 3 minutes, where I'm just going to pose a question for you just to start framing the overall conversation and the stuff that I'm going to talk about. I will post it in the chat. So if you're not used to Zoom, there is a chat right at the bottom of the window. There's a little chat icon. If you open that, you will see the chat. The question will follow you to your breakout rooms. So you can open the chat again in your breakout room and you will see the question. It's just about having a 2 to 3 minute chat. You can either just introduce yourselves or you can try and answer the question. It's totally up to you. No rights, no wrongs. So there's the question. Over to you, Nina. Okay. So there's no right or wrong answer to those questions. The aim was just to start framing a few ideas that we're going to be going more deeply into. So I'll talk a little bit about why I use those questions to start with. I don't know if anyone has read the work of Gareth Morgan. If you have, those metaphors would have been pretty obvious early on. In the Morgan argues in Images of Organization that there are certain dominant metaphors of organization, sense-making metaphors of organization. So they are machine, culture, organism, and brain. So this is the way that the mainstream thinkers have thought about organization. And then that there are some more radical ones. The one I included was psychic prison, but you can also have instrument of domination, flux and transformation, and political system. And his argument is very simple, is that in order to understand an organizational system, you have to look through all of the lenses So one lens will reveal something but will obscure something else, so that you actually have to look through all 8 lenses. And I know that Dave Snowden talked to you a couple of weeks ago, and this relates to what Dave Snowden would call tropes.
Yeah.
So what happens when you use a metaphor? It's one of the 4 master tropes. The 4 master tropes are metaphor, metonymy, synecdeca, and irony. You don't need to worry too much about the technicalities, but the basic thing is metaphor is just a perspective. It's a lens to understand something. When you use it over time, it doesn't speak. It's not a lens that is creative anymore. It's a lens that traps you into a certain way of thinking. So you start seeing everything in the organization as a culture or as a machine or as an organism, and you can't escape it. So that's when so the trope builds into a lens that is hardened and ossified, and you cannot escape. So they're the 3 more master tropes. Sort of, you go from just being a creative imagination, what would it be like if we thought of an organization as a culture, to an organization is a culture, and then you're trapped into that way of thinking. What I'm going to look at is irony, when irony is the way in which you actually try and escape that way of thinking. And the reason I got interested in irony, it was part of a 14-year research project on a transforming organization in steel. So they were moving from a very traditionalist way of behaving into a more modern or more contemporary way of behaving. And we had multidisciplinary academics going into the steelworks with totally open access to absolutely everything, which is very rare in itself. And what we found from all of these multidisciplinary academics was the characteristic that most manifested in all of the people that they were talking to was something they called an ironic sensibility. And they're saying that all of the people that are the most interesting seem to be poking fun at the organization, poking fun at the transformation, poking fun at the managers, poking fun at our research, and poking fun at themselves. So they weren't ever taking anything seriously. Yet at the same time, they seemed to understand more about what was going on than anybody else in the organization. And everybody wanted to work with them, so that they were deeply popular. And so my role was to try and work out what was going on with these people, explain their behaviors, explain what they were doing, and why, in many terms, they were the highest performing employees in the organization. So it became a deep study into the various different dimensions of irony, and that's what I'm going to try and share with you. So I'm going to go. I do have a couple of slides to go through, which I'm just going to navigate.
One of the best things I can do is like no phone, no screen by 2 hours before lights out.
Yeah.
So here's a shared screen. Let me just see if I can get into presentation mode. So basically, an irony is a coping device, either a coping device for those who live in a complex world, the snorkel of sanity, or evidence of a troublemaker who won't accept simple reality, the devil's mark. So whenever you're looking at irony, they are the 2 poles. Is it good or is it bad? And I don't think this has ever been ever been solved. But the dimensions, so we already looked a little bit about perspective. So the idea that an organization can be a machine or an organism or a culture, etc. The ironic perspective, it doesn't actually look at the thing itself. It looks at the space between the thing and the reality. So instead of seeing an organization as a culture, for example, the ironist would perceive the gap between the aspirations and achievements of the culture metaphor. So the organization would say that these are our aspirational culture. The ironist would see the gap between that and reality. So the gap between rhetoric and reality, it looks at the in-between space. Now, because looking at the in-between space is quite dangerous, because people are very, very attached to the one way of thinking that they've imposed across the organization. The ironic performance is about saying one thing and meaning another. You can't directly tell somebody that their perspective on the organization is foolish. You have to illustrate it in a more indirect manner. So the ironic performance is that way of illustrating indirectly what is right and what is wrong and where this gap is. And you have to do it without losing your head, because obviously if every time you reveal a gap between rhetoric and reality, you get fired, you're not going to have a very interesting career. And the last part then is, well, how do I do that? And I can see I've got a spelling mistake here. As I said, I spent a lot of time on these slides. Personality is an entire life colored by irony. So that you do this throughout your career. It becomes a strategy for living. How do I look at the in-between? How do I reveal the in-between? How do I do it in a way that adds value to my own life and to the organization? And how do I do that throughout my life? So they're the three things that I'm looking at when I talk about irony, within that continuum of some people are going to think you're brilliant and other people are going to think that you are a troublemaker who needs to have their head cut off. And then we have the type of irony that we revealed in the organization. So we actually looked at all of the work on organizational irony over the last 40, 50 years, plus our own data. And we looked at 4 different types of ironists that emerged in the data. And I've got the 4 different types here. And this is sort of going to move us into the first breakout room for you to reflect on what type you are or what type you see. So the first one is the Apollonian or the godlike ironist. Now, the Apollonian ironist is somebody who believes that they have created a perfect description or reality of the world. So their theory that they've created explains everything more perfectly than anybody in the organization understands. So they detach themselves from the organization and they describe it through their own lens, whereas everything that they describe is seen as an objective reality, and everything everybody else is going through is subjective. So they have this detached godlike lens in which everything they see is clear and objective and perfect, and everything everybody else done is unclear and subjective and imperfect, and they relate to the organization from that highly superior lens. I am more intellectual, I am better, I know what I'm talking about, you are all fools. So that's the first type of ironist. Within all academic disciplines and within all organizational disciplines, there are many people who take this theoretical position and say, my theory explains everything. The second type is the sarcastic type, and this is the type before the research we were doing. This is the type that dominated the literature. And the sarcastic type is somebody who does the work in the organization and then moves into a informal or semi-formal or liminal space where they're talking with colleagues, and then they poke fun at what is going on. So they move from the serious space of doing the work to an unserious space of poking fun, but these two spaces are always separate. So the poking fun is just an external commentary. It's not actually doing anything to change anything. It becomes a defense mechanism. And they just poke fun. They go, oh, look at the foolish managers and look at the foolish people who believe this kind of stuff from a safe position with like-minded others, but without actually getting themselves dirty. So that's the sarcastic ironist. The third type is the trickster. And this is the kind of stuff that my research looked at. So this is somebody who is capable of doing the poking fun. So they look at the work being done and they find it foolish, and they also do it well. And what they're trying to do here is they're looking at that in-between space, the gaps between aspirations and achievements, and they're trying to do something with it in real time. So whilst they're seeing it, the foolish gap and the problems with the rhetoric, they're not just sitting aside and poking fun. They're trying to reveal it in ways that won't get their head cut off. And they're trying to do something on it with it in real time with others that makes a difference in the organization. In the research that we looked at, these were normally middle managers in that gap between what senior management expected and the worker reality, and they were playing around with that interpretive gap, trying to make sense of things and translate and help people understand the more complex reality. And then finally, you've got the wise ironist. And again, these tend to be older characters, mentor types, and they've seen sort of waves of thinking come and go in the past. And so that they're looking at, well, what is really going on behind the scenes? What is the real politic in the organization? What are the deeper themes informing all of this? And they perform two roles. One is that they become advisory. They actually help the tricksters and the people stuck in the midst of the chaos understand it all. So they're giving them access to these multiple perspectives in quite a wise and serious way. And the other role is actually pulling some of the strings behind the scenes. So whereas they're not obviously in the work like the trickster would be, they're sitting somewhere behind the scenes, they're pulling strings, they're making things happen. So again, it's quite a real politic position to be taking, sitting slightly outside the organization, tugging strings and doing stuff. It's a very classic character type in literature. So Gandalf the Wise, for example, would be this kind of type where he's sitting in the Lord of the Rings, pulling people hither and thither from a wise position without necessarily being that deeply involved in the plot. So they're the types of ironists that the research clearly reveals going on in complex organizations, especially complex organizations going through transformations. So what I'm going to do is post a set of questions.
We're not in the main session, but I would say,
yeah.
Oh, are we? I guess we are.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're still on deck, Becky. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Still
everyone's
here.
back.
We seem to have lost Shrikant. No, he's there. I can see Shrikant. You're in a different place. So yeah, we can have a little bit of a group reflection before I go on as to normally we would ask people to sort of just stick some notes in the chat. What was? Let me see if I can find what was confirmed, what was new, and what was unclear. I'm just going to stick 3 questions in the chat. If anyone, please just jot in the chat, yeah, or speak, Katrina. Up to you, Katerina. Yeah, what?
So
Go ahead.
The question I have is, in my experience, different people play different roles depending on the context.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's also a lot of variables in this. So my question to you is, what did you find in your research? Because I think men will play irony differently than women will. I think irony is difficult across cultures, and will have a lot of variability across cultures. I teach at one of the colleges here in Toronto, and what I find, a lot of the very well-respected, very well-liked profs basically are saying they can't use any humor in their classroom, even when we're face-to-face, because it just can be misunderstood way too easily. And they've had really, really bad experiences. And these guys I know them, they're really good guys, and very well liked by the students. So it's not a personality issue, it's a cultural issue. So I'm curious how much culture plays into this. And this might be a second question, but it might fit in as well. I find three of these characters that you described as being nasty. Like there's a real nasty element to it. The Apollonian, the sarcastic, and the trickster. There's a real mean streak to it. So I'm really curious if maybe I'm misunderstanding the definitions, or again, how that connects to different cultures and different environments.
Okay, so culturally, maybe between cultures, there will be challenges. What we've found in the research is there's evidence of this happening in East Asia. So there's quite a bit of research out of Japan, Scandinavia, America. So the initial research was actually an Israeli academic working in the Boston Tech Corridor. So it was at the time, it was DEC, or the Digital Equipment Corporation. That was the company, which then their culture highly influential to Silicon Valley now. So that was sort of where he saw it. And then my research is in Australian steelwork. So we've seen different industries, and we've seen, so to Japan, it was manufacturing. I can't remember whether Scandinavian, but it was manufacturing, steel, high tech. Across 4 quite different cultures, although cultures that there's some egalitarian similarities between Scandinavia and Australia, but there's so we've seen it. It might not translate between cultures. I did have the fortune to be working with a few Chinese and Iranian graduates as well, and they say no, that we do this in our culture, and it might actually be something more necessary in some of their cultures, because when I talk about losing your head, I mean you can genuinely lose your head. So there might be a greater sensitivity there than perhaps in a culture where you just lose your job, etc. The nastiness, so that goes back into the idea between the snorkel of sanity or the devil's mark. Okay, so it can be both, and the interpretation is always that it can be both. So within the research, the trickster, some of them are Machiavellian bastards. They really are. They are just looking to create value for the person who's going to pay them more. Others are no. I'm really playing around with the reality to try and create a better way to do the work for everybody involved, where you have less psychological stress. You do the work more effectively, etc., etc. And I think you can apply that to all. So even the Apollonian, who says, my perspective on reality is perfect and everybody else is a fool. They still believe that if the people were listening to them and doing the work the way that they said that you should do the work, it would be a better world. They might be superior and arrogant, but they still believe in what they're doing. And I think a lot of what I talk about in the rest will start to move further into those questions. I've got a few other questions. Becky, do you want to ask yours? I hope that answered some of it, Katerina.
So in our group, we were asking questions, is the goal of irony to close the gap? Is it just to survive? Is it to bridge it? Or is it to understand the rules so that you can use them in a more purposeful way to close the gap?
I mean, the aim is, I think, revealing the gap is first, because if you don't reveal the gap, then you can't do meaningful work. So the aim is the first aim is revelatory. There is a gap, that there's always a gap between the aspirations and achievements, and that there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think you're ever going to close the gap. And for me, the irony is, so the gap is the only objective reality that's always there. So the idea to close the gap to an extent, but it's not only so it's not so big that everybody falls through it. So using the roles more purposefully. I mean, the aim, the thing for me, and we had a little talk about Bridgewater in our breakout. So that one of the things for me is recognize that there's more going on than just psychometrics reveals, and if you understand sort of these kind of complex roles that are going on, then you can start recognizing that the different interpretations than the mainstream are vital, and you can plug into them. So it's just an awareness rather than necessarily a purpose, because you don't know what's going to manifest out of the ironic role expected. So I'll quickly go into Donald's question. So Donald, you asked why are these the only types of ironic roles? Why were they chosen? So two answers. One, academia. So you need to have a 2x2 in management academia nowadays. But two, they did emerge from the literature. So I go in. So the Apollonian comes from Nietzsche's work on the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The sarcastic ironist comes from the Greek choruses, when the Greek comedies were, that was the role that the chorus played. And then the trickster and the wise ironist come from much more modern literatures. So the trickster, for example, well, I mean, you noticed I had a TARDIS behind me. Doctor Who is a trickster, stroke wise ironist. Jeeves and Worcester. Jeeves is a wise ironist. Columbo is a wise ironist or a trickster ironist. So that if you actually look at the dramatic studies of this through a couple of millennia, the same character types continue to emerge. So we're just applying those to organizations.
Yeah, I've noticed that in the Norse tradition, the trickster is a big deal.
Yeah.
And in the indigenous tradition, the trickster is always around somewhere.
Yeah, and a constant part of sort of mainstream thinking as well. I mean, it's something that we've forgotten rather than is missing. So I hope that answered that question as well. I think I should, but I'll try and move on because I think a lot of what I'm going to do in the rest will answer some of the rest of the questions. So let me again just navigate back to the slides, and I will move on. Okay, so what we're really now looking at is more the transformational world that the ironist manifests in. So again, these are things that happen over time. So I'm looking at thousands of years of history where they look at dimensions of decadence. So the argument in the literature is very clear. When a culture or a society becomes decadent, then ironists emerge. So I've got sort of 8 dimensions here of decadence that, again, very clear in hundreds of years of research on this. And the first one, so there's this, in a decadent society or civilization, there becomes deep interest in what is artificial and what is authentic. And I don't think I need to do much illustration about why that's going on in our society at the moment. I mean, that is everywhere. Between you've got, Instagram to bring your authentic self to the workforce. It's absolutely everywhere, and we're dealing with these tensions every day. You've then got this interest in curiosity and creativity. So within a decadent society, there's this sort of feeling of boredom and frustration that manifests. And so they're looking for people who are curious and creative to try and help us escape from this bored frustration that holds everyone in sort of in tension. So there's no loss of energy in a decadent system. The energy is there, it just doesn't know how to manifest. So that's what they're looking at in terms of the manifestation. Can we be curious and creative about something? And that isn't necessarily good or bad. So part of the curiosity and creativity could give us escape routes. So here's a way to break into a new way of being, to transform into a new existence. But it could be curiosity and creativity about the perverse and the grotesque, which sort of goes into the next two. So, the perverse and the grotesque is, well, how the egoism, how do I become so interested in self that I move into egoistic, perverse, narcissistic understanding of self? And how do I become so interested and creative in ways of making money that I actually fall to corruption? So there's a huge amount of research and both of these at the moment. One of the most interesting things that I'm finding is, and I've talked to Becky Andre, who's here on the call about this, is this notion that a lot of the spiritual practice that has been corporatized is creating higher levels of egoism rather than a loss of ego. Mm-hmm. So you're seeing narcissism as an output of mindfulness, which is just mind-bogglingly ironic to me, but it's becoming quite clear. So again, but it's part of these wider dimensions of decadence. And the last part is perversity and sexuality, and you're seeing a big discourse around this notion at the moment in the gender debates and the transgender debates in the US. Is it something that we should celebrate, these multidimensionals of sexuality, or is it perverse? So I think you can clearly see all 8 of these in contemporary culture and contemporary ways of thinking and speaking. I think the top ones, artificiality and authenticity, are the most obvious, but I think all the others are out there, and it doesn't take much looking to find evidence. So that's the dimensions of decadence. And again, within the literature, and we're talking a couple of millennia, this is when these happen, when these manifest, this is when the transformational ironist emerges. So what we're looking at is the idea that, and you can talk about it being an organizational system within a larger social system, or the social system itself. And we're talking about, there are 3 different perspectives on how we need to transform. So what I've done is I've just put 3 names of thinkers who relate to each of these perspectives, and then the perspectives itself. So the classic structural way of thinking about it is Hegel, Durkheim, and Marx. So these sort of classic sociologists, and they argue that turbulence in the system is only temporary, and we're actually going to be there's actually going to be an inevitable progress to a perfect social system. And for me, when you listen to lots of the right versus left debates in the North American world, that's what I see both sides coming from. So the right comes from the sort of the Hegelian Durkheim, that we've been on this correct path, and we just continue building these structures, and eventually we will perfect this path. And the left is coming from, we've got to tear down those structures and put up new structures, which will create another path towards a perfect social system. But it's actually coming from opposite sides of the same coin. It's just around build the structures of the system. If you get the structures correct, then you're going to create a utopian or perfect social system. Because that's the classic sociological argument. Not many people take it seriously outside these echo chamber debates. So anyone in serious academia that I know goes, well, that's not the way the world works anymore. So the bottom 2 are the ones that I think are taken more seriously in certainly the work I do. So the first is Vico, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. And that really goes into the decadent stuff. So it's just indications that the current system is decaying and ready to be transformed. So again, you can see this sort of the tensions in a lot of these debates at the moment. Have we got to the end point of a cycle? So how is this cycle? And we're looking maybe at a 100-year cycle for culture, and maybe a 40-year cycle for organizations. Have we got to an end point of a cycle? And are we ready to transform it? And then how do we do that? And so ironists emerge to open up the transformational space, to try and create something new. So this is where the curiosity and creativity come in. Are we opening up that space? And then the work that I'm most interested in, which is Bauman, Giddens, and Beck. So Bauman, Giddens, and Beck says, look, what we're experiencing is the inevitable and irreversible fragmentation and liquefaction of any complex social system. So in a complex social system, meaning is going to become more and more contested. There's going to be more and more interpretations of reality. And our role is to work out how to live in that reality and tap into the dynamic possibilities of that reality to try and solve problems at smaller levels, where they're sort of almost personalized or community-based, et cetera, et cetera. And the ironist, in this one, the ironist is the person who has the elegance and poise to live in such a system without breaking down. Okay, so that's sort of the second section. And again, I will share some questions in relation to that for the breakout. Give me 1 second. Okay, so again, a bit of a summary of what I'm talking about and some questions to inform your chat. Okay, I've found my set of questions, so here they are in the chat. So again, please just spend a couple of times reflecting, answer that question in written form, and then we'll have a few verbal summaries, etc. So stick in the chat what you think, whatever comes to mind in relation to those questions.
We should play The Doors. Welcome back to the other side.
Okay, so I'm going to start by asking Joanne, what was your great perspective about corruption? Can you share with the wider group?
Growing up in communist China, so that's my comment. I said, if you think Western governments are corrupt, you have never seen corruption. As most people here are Canadians. If you think sponsorship scandal, We Charity scandal, or Donald Trump, or Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, I've worked on both sides of the border, are corrupt. You have never seen corruption.
So how would you define what real corruption is?
To people grown up in communist China, and I do have some Russian friends, or the former Soviet Union. That's a part of doing business, and that's business as usual.
So I think most of the communist bloc that embraced capitalism, it did it in a very interesting form. Let's put it that way. So they really took corruption at a different level.
But it's not always seen as corruption, though, because North Americans look at a lot of the way that people do things in China as corrupt. But it's a different system, right? It's about, I know you, you know me, and we help each other out. It's almost like the Ferengi system. So I don't think they don't see it as corrupt, because they've built success on having this, I know, helping each other out to get ahead. There's always victims somewhere along the line, but I don't think they wouldn't label it corruption the way that North Americans label it corruption.
But
it's a very different way of relating to each other.
But is corruption the problem, or I know it's a problem, but our whole world seems to be focusing on growth, but there seems to be the factors of resilience and sustainability that don't seem to have measures. But if you took a better balance, then people would value other things other than just getting as much money and getting as rich as possible.
Yeah. Is that the kind of corruption that you were referring to, Richard, or were you thinking of like a kind of moral corruption?
You can take it from both perspectives. So I think at the heart of it is people not understanding what a good life is, and just going, right, good life equals I can grow, I'm going to just get more money, I'm going to grow self, I'm going to, rather than that more complex set of values and multiple set of values that you're working towards. So it becomes a narrowing of this is the only thing worth pursuing. And then if you believe there's only one thing worth pursuing, then you can end up pursuing it in a very corrupt way. So you can have a corrupt self, or you can be corrupt in terms of trying to grab money.
something's very interesting. If you look at some of the richest people in the world, someone like Bill Gates, and so I wouldn't want to have Bill Gates as my enemy, but it's amazing how much the Gates Foundation now is pumping back into, to solve hunger and and bring the lowest billion people up, right, along with other people that are doing that. And so it's the people that, did Bill Gates get to where he is without upsetting anybody and not doing things sort of on the edge? I don't know. Not think so. But it's kind of interesting how he's actually using some of his money to through the Gates Foundation to change things around.
When I say if you haven't lived in say Mao's China or Soviet Union, you've never seen corruption. I mean all sorts of corruption, not just financial, moral. It's a whole different level of systemic corruption. People turned against one another. That's a commonplace. There is no trust among people, and that to me is always haunting. It's just there's no words to describe what that is.
I would 100% agree with you. My relatives were Japanese Canadian, and the British Columbia government in World War II took all their belongings away, made us sell our business for pennies, made us pay for our internment during the war, right? And they prevented my father from going to school. They didn't provide any education, and they kicked all the Japanese Canadians out of university during World War II. So it does happen here too. I agree about the trust. There is a problem with trust.
So Richard, I do want to ask, I think Donald said that in our group, Becky, Donald, and three of us, and he says, is decadence a good thing or bad thing?
So yeah, we talked a little bit about that. I think I made it clear about enough. We talked about that in our breakout. It's neither good nor bad. What it is trapped energy. So there's you lose the ability to release energy in a way that actually makes you feel like you're contributing. You're building a better system. There's all of this energy sitting around, but there's no outputs that you're happy contributing to. And part of decadence itself, it creates this energy. I mean, you're in a position where more and more people sort of go, oh, I've got stuff I want to do, but I don't know where my output is. So it's neither good or bad. It's just a state. The challenge is how do you find those avenues for that give you what you're wrestling for, that deeper meaning and purpose, rather than just go and do. And for me, the artificiality and authentic stuff is, do I go and do Instagram posts and cover myself in tinsel to make my life look fantastic, versus if I'm doing just a deep inner reflection on self, and I'm spending all my energy on that, well, that's also not particularly useful. So we're looking at where are the useful avenues? Where are the things that will give us meaning? Where are the things that we will find purpose in? And that's what tends to happen in the decadent system, is that they're removed from us, but we have more and more energy because we're trying to find them again. And so it's sort of that spinning hamster wheelie kind of thing, but it's not necessarily bad. It's just it's part of a search. I hope that answered. It's a complex question, so I hope the answer wasn't even more complex than the question. Okay, so again, I'm going to go into the last section. I think the last one will begin to answer some of those questions as well. So let me go into my slides for the last time. Okay, so now we're looking at, I think, the complex stuff we've just been wrestling with, which is 3 different interpretations of wrestling with this ironic gap. And to the first one, I think we're talking about that idea of the authentic self. So the Socratic Ironist. So this is know thyself. I mean, everyone who's heard of Socrates has heard this know thyself. You know, you need the purpose of your life is to know thyself. And in order to know thyself, when you perfectly know yourself, you can live the perfect life. Now, I don't think Socrates believed that for an instant, but that's the way it's become interpreted through the literature: is know thyself perfectly, know thyself authentically, and by doing that, you can find the values that relate to external values that relate to your internal ones, and you can live this perfect life. And I don't think Socrates believe that for a second. So the interesting work the work I use on Socrates is that Socrates, because he never wrote anything down, and I think you can look at these characters in our history that are held up as perfect beings, both spiritually and rationally, who never wrote anything down. So the version of them has been created by others. And it's not about looking authentically and internally. It's looking about how you create your life. It's a creative act in which Socrates gave us the tools to create ourselves and to create a life that is the right life for our time and age, but is very different from the life that he created. So knowing the self is knowing how the self creates itself within the society that it's within, to try and live as best life as possible rather than a perfect life. And that's the Socratic ironists, that's what they're wrestling with. It's impossible to perfectly know the self. It's impossible to live a perfect life. But that's the thing I keep in my head, the impossible idea that I try and strive towards, whilst knowing it's impossible. And then you can look at different interpretations of irony. So I've got Kierkegaardian. So Swift was looking at, and specifically in Gulliver's Travels, he was looking at how you design the perfect social or organizational system. And that was what Gulliver was after. Gulliver was trying to find, can you design the Hegelian rational kind of system where everybody lives the life that's perfectly suited to them, designed for them by the system. And he discovers that you can't. He discovers the society that gets closest to it is actually almost insane. And so he comes back to, so Gulliver comes back to England, and he sort of retreats because he recognizes that this is an impossible dream, and then you would retreat into insanity. Swift's position is that if I have in my head the idea of a perfect system that I recognize is never going to be realized because it's impossible to do this, but again, it's something to strive towards whilst also recognizing I can never create it. So that gap is inevitable. That stops you becoming either total zealot for a system that you're trying to impose on others, or a total cynic about all systems. So you're trying to be in that ironic space in between. And then the final one is Kierkegaard. So Kierkegaard is about how do you make perfectly ethical and rational decisions about how to behave, focusing more on the ethical, but you rationalize the ethical. So he was obsessed with, before I act, how do I make sure my actions don't cause harm to others? And then the realization that when you act, that requires faith, because you can never be sure. You have to have the leap to faith, where you eventually have to rely on almost the intuitive. I have to trust myself that I've done all the reflective work possible to act in a way that I think it might still. So you've got that going on. The wrestle within the Kierkegaardian mind is, I can never be perfectly ethical, but if I try to be perfectly ethical, I can't act, and therefore I'm useless, and I'm struggling with that challenge. And so Kierkegaard for me is the greatest thing to an irony perhaps that ever lived. And so this is the way he framed it. And we've talked a little bit about authenticity in my breakout. And I actually think a lot of the way people understand authenticity at the moment is what Kierkegaard called immediacy. And immediacy is that you just respond to the situation in front of you without thinking. So it's responding in almost a vomiting up. This is what I feel, and because I'm feeling it, therefore I will express my feelings. Kierkegaard says this is immediacy, not authenticity, and he is the forefather of authentic philosophy. So he said this is immediacy, this is not authenticity, it's the opposite of authenticity. Just expressing what you're feeling is immediacy. You cannot live a meaningful life if that's what you always do. There has to be a reflective component that you move into before you talk. And he said the first movement into reflection is aestheticism. So you try and say, well, okay, is what I do, does it provide beauty? Am I creating a life that is beautiful? And so every time you decide to act from that perspective, you're deciding to act based on the beauty of the situation. I'm going to do this because it feels beautiful to me. But this is where relativism becomes a problem, because you act, it feels beautiful, it feels great, you do it, you feel good about it. But then that becomes no longer beautiful. You get bored. You want to do something else because that no longer holds your interest, because the aesthete wants interest, wants beauty, wants something to keep them going. So they move from one space to another space, and they change. They go, I want to do this, and then that gets exhausted, and then they want to do something else, and that gets exhausted, and they want to do something else, and that gets exhausted. And over time, everything gets exhausted. So they slip into despair. There's actually nothing, there's no way that you can say this is better than that, because beauty and self-interest is the only thing that matters. There's no way of making any kind of ethical decisions about this is more valuable than that. You just slip into existential despair. So the next movement is into ethicism. And this is the ethicist. When I act, it has to be ethical. It's not about beauty. It's about not causing harm to others. So I act in an ethical way. So everything I do is supposed to move the world forward in a way that doesn't cause harm to others. But the problem is, for the ethicist, is that that's impossible. That you can't reflect on every action to the extent that you know it's not going to cause harm before you do it, because you suffer action paralysis, because every action might cause harm. So you end up just reflecting and reflecting and reflecting and talking and talking and talking, and you never make the jump or the leap to faith to actually act itself. So he talks about mastered irony. This is where irony becomes incredibly important. So the mastered ironist oscillates between the passion of the aesthetic and the reflection of the ethicist. So they move into the aesthetic experience. Go, I'm going to enjoy this when I'm there. I'm going to be enthusiastic. I'm going to do it. I'm going to live it. I'm going to have passion, until it starts feeling absurd to me. And when that feels absurd, I'm going to move into the ethical position where I look at many different possible ways of acting that would cause less harm to people, because this absurdity is not just impacting me, it's impacting others, and it's creating despair and it's creating angst. So I move into the ironic sphere where I can reflect on all possible ways of acting, or as many possible ways of acting as I can. That's what irony does. It makes the actual absurd, and then you detach from it and you see many, many possibilities. So to go back to the original exercise of the metaphors, what would this look like from a culture perspective, or a machine perspective, or a psychic prison perspective? And you look at it from all of these different lenses. And in order not to get trapped into that reflection, eventually the ironist makes that reflective stance absurd itself, because you can't act. So just reflect. So that has to seem absurd. And once that seems absurd, the reflective stance seems absurd. You fly back into the world again, and into this passionate stance. So there's this constant oscillation between passion and reflection that you move in and out of in the process of acting within the world itself. So you're trying to act ethically, but you're trying to act ethically in a way that enthuses you until it no longer enthuses you, and then you go back into the ethical stance until that seems absurd. So you're on this constant loop. And so that's really what the ironists that we found in the workplace were doing. They were becoming enthusiastic about something on the ground, but when you took them into a reflective stance, they were able to poke fun at it and make it absurd while still be passionate about it whilst they were in the action. Which will take me to my last set of questions. If you give me a second to frame the last breakout. Okay, so a few minutes again of reflection. Here's the questions in the chat.
Thank you, Katerina. This is the book. I'll put the author and the title.
Ian McGilchrist, one of the great neuroscience books ever
Yes,
written.
yeah. I loved his books, and I was into neuroscience, so I read this quite a few years ago.
Well, you're about as one of the guys Becky and I work with knows Ian quite well. So in Ian's terms, you are the 7th person in the world who's read the book all the way through. So well done, Joanne.
Thank you very much. I so thoroughly enjoyed it, and I wrote a blog about it. Well, there was Katerina, I think, knows that blog, The Thinking Simpler and Deeper.
Could you stick a link in the chat so everyone can have a read?
Because
I think his work is spectacular, and really talks to that shift between the both sides of the brains and being enthusiastic and rational and moving in and out of a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about.
Yes.
There's a film. His book has been filmed on Vimeo as well, and not particularly well, but enough to give an understanding that's quite useful. So there is a film version of the book, or a document.
That's
okay.
the book, and that's this, and that's the blog I did not long ago, and it has a coverage. So I really, this is the book that inspired that blog.
I've heard of it, yeah.
So I'll try and answer some of the questions. So Shrikant, what was your mastered ironist is idealistic? Yeah, and arguably bloody difficult.
It is. So essentially that's why they give up on it, right? So it's easier being the biased, weak humans that we are, doing the mundane because that's easy to do, rather than step back and do it aesthetically, ethically, and also find the balance and context while doing it at each point in time for the variety of contexts that we are in. So that's hard work.
True. I mean, and again, it's Kierkegaard's where this comes from. I mean, it took him 20 years to work this out. So it's not something that just comes like that. It's hard, it's tough, it's tricky. It takes effort. And that there are a number of tensions. So yeah, idealistic and incredibly difficult, but at least worth keeping in the back of your mind. Jeff, you're quite, you wrote a statement. Could you talk a little bit about
that? Sure. I was just reflecting on our conversation in terms of, trying to get towards perfection, and sometimes using methodologies like agile. And part of that requires you to acknowledge problems or issues. But of course, where I work, which is in government, it's very risk averse. There's not much reward for acknowledging mistakes, even if it'll lead to better outcomes, because people higher up the chain, even if the individual who made the mistakes is willing to admit it, or the person immediately above that, usually further beyond that, they don't want to be tarred with any potential failure, even if it will lead to future success, because that'll impact their current or next position, right? And that's what they're more interested in, right? The climbing the greasy pole than better results in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the interesting things I think here, and I haven't really talked about it, but the difference between irony and sarcasm, and the reason that everybody interprets irony as sarcasm. So irony is literally, here's the gap between rhetoric and reality, or aspirations and achievement. So an ironist is just trying to say, it's a little bit more complex, and let's play around with that complexity. But we hear sarcasm, and sarcasm literally means to tear the flesh. So what we hear is somebody, when they reveal the gap, what we hear them saying is, this is your fault, you're stupid. And so that's when ego starts to get in the way. And so to Jeff's point is, we defend against our mistakes because we don't hear what's being said. The world is complex, and we are all fragile and flawed and foolish. And we need all of our brain and work out what a solution might be. We hear, you're an idiot because you caused this. And that's where the ego defenses come into play. So the last one, Badra, do you want to talk about common sense? I know we're running a little bit over time, but I would love to hear a reflection on common sense.
Actually, it was a comment made by Rencia, and I really liked it a lot. That I think that usually we get stuck in the common practice, which does not necessarily make sense, because if it made sense, it would become like a common sense. And I was making a comment that actually common sense sometimes is either like counterintuitive or even more challenging, in the sense that it's against what is known, or what is considered like the common practice. And then Francia made that comment, which I like, that common sense not always makes sense. That was the context that we were talking about. And the whole idea was that if like similar to what Sri was saying, that being stuck in what works because we don't know what else, or not necessarily doing the hard work of digging deeper and understanding what is the problem, or digging deeper, doing the work of reflection and the oscillation between reflection and passion, we tend not to do that. And because of that, we stick with what works, or what we've been told. So yeah, I'm not sure if that makes sense what I said, but that's what we meant.
No. So the reason I wanted you to say that, so I talked right at the beginning when I showed the metaphors, and I talked about metonymy and cynic Decker as the master tropes. So cynic Decker, the guys working in this space, so this is trope number one. This is how we speak. And what it means is received wisdom that seems good. Okay, so that somewhere there's a system of thinking that we are receiving from external points to us, and it seems good to us. So it seems like common sense. And so it locks us into a certain perspective on the world that we interpret as common sense, because everybody's using that language and everybody understands it. But it's not necessarily any better way to explore the world than alternative perspectives. Irony is the fourth master trope. And what I've been talking about here really is trying to break that sense of received wisdom that seems good through taking multiple, without getting too angst-ridden or upset by it, by taking joy and humor and play in it as we go through it. I wouldn't worry. There is an essay called The Master Tropes, which explains this. I wouldn't read it. It's one of the most difficult essays I've ever tried to understand. But yeah, so basically it's just like this is how language works. This is how rhetoric works. This is what we get locked into certain perspectives of the world. Ian McGilchrist also, if you're reading that book, and it is one of the most difficult books you'll ever read as well, even though it's brilliant, he will also talk about similar kind of things, the role of metaphor and irony and the right brain, etc., etc. So I recognize we're out of time. If there's any more questions, I'm happy to stay on another 10 minutes. If not, I will hand back to Srikanth.
And before we jump into questions, just want to say thank you to Richard before people start dropping off. And we also have Becky Andre here. I'd like to recognize that we posted the next event on March 30th, where Becky is presenting on about another topic of hers at the group. It's already posted on the group.
Yes, we'll be talking about the role of meta skills and
Yes.
how our approaches can develop meta skills and how meta skills can help us be more effective in our approaches.
So thank you, Becky. So we look forward to, and we are planning to run it in a fairly similar format as a dialogue rather than as a presentation. Somebody speaks and we all go home, and we want to integrate more and synthesize our learning. So I feel that's a good format. That's why we're copying the work that Richard does with EQ Labs.
So Srikanth, I'm just going to post a link in. So this is the research we've done around why this works and what benefits dialogical learning have in terms of stickiness and memory and creativity and innovation, etc. So you know, we know it. We've been doing it for about a year. And the impact it's had on my life by doing a couple of these every week for a year, and the level of knowledge that I've gained has just been mind-blowing. So this talk was complex. It took me 7 years to understand all of this. So in 2 hours, I'm hoping some of it made sense to you and I didn't do such a terrible job, because it was never easy for me to understand. So I recognize that it's a lot thrown at you, but the aim is that the conversations and the dialogues you have, the sense making within those is what matters much more than the theory and the stuff I throw at you. And that's where the learning takes place. And if there's little bits of my stuff that sticks, that's fine, but it's not as important as the conversations you had. So thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Not at all. Anytime, Richard.
So yeah, any other questions? I'm happy to stay on for 10 minutes. If not, it's been wonderful.
Yeah.
So please don't be shy.
I'm not necessarily a question, but maybe a point. But again, I don't want to hold anybody if anyone wants to drop. Like one of the things actually when I was reading the description of the event and trying to understand, as ignorant as I am, like irony to me is actually about like sarcasm, but then understanding what exactly it means, it hit me because recently I've been trying to learn more about like the Socratic approach, or by asking questions as opposed to trying to propose ideas as a way to either like communicate an idea or a thought or even learn myself. And I find like a good relationship, and I'm not sure if that's correct or I am on a completely off path, where irony involves actually asking questions and revealing the understanding to the receiving person, to the receiving audience, like they get to the idea, or they make the real to a person just telling the receiving party what to understand or what to make out of the conversation. And the idea of when someone get to that realization themselves, and how it connects to how the brain works and the dopamine kick that happens with that. So by not following irony, we are actually depriving the group or the person from that, I'm not sure what to call, like that reward or that energy that comes with the self-realization, which actually generates the energy for them to even like dig further or even come up with their own ideas or add up on the conversation. Am I on a correct track here, or actually, are they related?
So it's a complex answer. I'll try and do the best I can. So Socrates it was originally attacked for being an ironist by a number of Greek playwrights and politicians. And in those days, the iron was just the dissembler. All you're doing is dissembling. You're a sophist. You're just trying to dissemble to win arguments. And then you had Plato and the sort of the early philosophers who were saying, no, he's not doing this. It's about, he's our leader. He's the one we're following. So you had that big argument, and there's been again 2,000 years of thinking about what Socrates was actually doing. So the first thing is the ironic stance he took, which is I know nothing. Okay, the only wisdom that I have is in knowing that I know nothing, that I am not wise. And that was seen as an ironic stance, in that because the philosophers were saying, no, you're the wisest of all of us. You know more than all of us. And Plato was trying to work out what he meant by it throughout his entire career. And so what Plato was looking at is Socrates already had the ideal form. He already knew the answers, and his role was to be a midwife and to help us realize these answers that he already knew. Versus another interpretation, which is the one that I prefer, is that every human conceptualization of a complex challenge or a complex concept is always going to be flawed. And he's trying to investigate these flaws and to make sure that, that we're trying to build a better and more sophisticated and elegant way of understanding reality. And that's always a difficult conversation. So a part of that means a freedom to ask questions, which is what he was doing, to recognize that neither of us know the answer, and the answer is going to emerge in the conversation. But secondly, it's the necessity for humor and the necessity for irony is to keep the difficult conversation going. So when the ego gets in the way, where somebody goes, no, I'm powerful and important and I know this, how do you keep that conversation going in a way that allows everybody to contribute without the ego blocking it and without people shutting it down? And then that's the life colored by irony stuff. I do this all the time because that's what motivates me, is to keep the difficult conversations going through wit and elegance and poise and irony, etc. To keep them going for as long as possible. Now, eventually, lots of people who do this lose their heads. I mean, Socrates was executed in the Roman Senate. Cicero did the same thing. He was murdered. But that's the core. Now, if you then trace the Roman interpretation of Socrates through Roman satires, there you've got the beginnings of the fool character. So the court jester who speaks truth to power. So that through Roman satires into the Middle Ages, you had become formalized within the European courts, that you needed to have the fool, an ironist speaking truth to power in a comedic manner, in order to the carnivalesque reversal of roles and to keep these conversations going. What we seem to have done is lost that in our we take everything so seriously. We've lost the appreciation of the people who can do that. So I talked a little bit about literature. So you've got these character types in literature throughout history, from the picaresques novels, the English Rogue, which was one of the no one's heard of it now, but it was one of the all-time best-selling plays and books around ironic character types. And in modern terms, so one of the reasons I say I use a TARDIS is Doctor Who is an ironic character type. There's a playing around with character and personality and saying one thing and meaning another, and performing in ways that reveal more and more truth to people slowly. Jeeves and Wooster does a similar thing, that he has that perspective on reality that's more complete than Wooster's, and uses it, and that's the trickster. So Katerina's point, almost Jesus is a wise trickster who Wooster's a fool, and you can argue that Jeeves is just helping Wooster in order to keep his cushy job, so he can be perceived as a little bit Machiavellian and nasty. But you can also look at Jeeves as, you know, Worcester's this quite nice character, and Jeeves is just trying to help everybody live good lives throughout the novel. So that there's, it's 2,000 years of literature exploring this. What I think we've lost in contemporary behavioral sciences is the appreciation of this dramatic role, because we're just looking at little boxes to put people in. So that a lot of what we're doing is trying to recreate, you know, that is necessary, that space. And to the stuff I was discussing it with Joanne in our opening breakout, the idea that we've all, until recent years, we've always had a secondary commentary going on in organizations, revealed through Dilbert cartoons sat on the wall and Gary Larson and this kind of stuff. So you've always had this ironic commentary going on cubicle walls. And the current workplace strategy movement is and clean desk policies is getting rid of that secondary interpretation of reality, the psychological release that has, but also the space that enables us to deal with the more complex reality that it enables. It's all being stripped away. And again, that comes out of the same thought process. It started with Socrates. You've got to have this humorous commentary that's in that ironic space in order to get us to think more and better. Ron, yeah.
Yeah, I forget where I read it, but I read that was like we lost all that when the last industrial revolution came forward, and they wanted to train people to memorize things, and they moved away from more of the classic ways of learning to the way that we were currently taught. And now we're cycling out of it, now that machines are actually taking and doing the manual effort, and they can remember the processes better than we could ever. So now we actually have to maybe go back to the scholars that used to run the universities versus the industrialists that sort of took over. So it's like a shift, but it's almost like we're going back to maybe where it was. I see you're nodding, so I guess maybe this
yeah,
is...
so I'm nodding because a lot of the book that Joanna suggested we read, Master and Emissary, is talking about these cultural movements.
Yes.
So he talks about, through history, periods of time where we've been far more left brain and logic and rational versus the more holistic, where the irony and the drama and the novelty and that desire to explore anything that isn't rational is part of culture. So he talks about going from Renaissance, which was holistic, to Enlightenment, which was left brain, to Romanticism, which was holistic, to modernity, which is left brain, and then some kind of, how do we get back into that holistic? Are we at the beginnings of that shift? Yes. As we move into the post-machine age?
So there's a really good book that I just read. It's called The Hype, and it goes into the science behind how all the technology works. But it shows how we become more polarization, which is what technology, the way that social media tends to do, tends to polarize us, and that's done through through technology. Us being on Facebook and Twitter, right? And then birds of a feather tend to flock together. But very interesting. The book also goes through. I don't mean to ruin the ending, but it sort of goes through is that polarization does come out. But when you actually start educating folks, and then you start pulling down some of those polarized thoughts, then what it says is, even though that's the way it looks, that the majority of people still fall in the middle, and the silent majority is too silent, right? And the left and the right seem to be speaking, but the rest of us in the middle are saying, like, what are you talking about?
So one of the challenges, and this is the other part of my research, where I look into ambivalence. So both, valence, strength. So you've got being. It doesn't mean indifference. You're pulled apart in a strong way. So what we're seeing in society is two different sides pulling against each other as strongly as possible, where they both think they have structural solutions to the complex situation. And what happens to the ironist? So this is where the concept of scapegoat comes. So either side that thinks it's pure is looking for the dirty scapegoat, the bit that doesn't fit, that if only you can expel it, then you're going to create that pure solution. So what happens with these extreme pulls is the moderate, initially the scapegoat was just in the middle, but now the moderates are, the space for the moderation is huge, and the purity is absolute. So the vast majority of us are in the potential scapegoats. And being a scapegoat, scapegoat means you're expelled completely. You have no role in society whatsoever. And that is the worst thing that can happen to you. You're sacrificed to the purity of the believers. And literally, they would kill you historically. And then you've got tragic and comic perspectives. So the tragic perspective is the scapegoat dies. Okay, so any drama when the scapegoat dies is a tragedy. The comic is, well, actually, what you're saying needs to be listened to and reintegrated into society. And so you play the role of the fool. So we go back into the jester. You're playing the role of the fool to be laughed at before what laughs at you is taken seriously, before it actually can make a difference. But the risk in trying to craft out that role is that you might get killed in the process of crafting out the comic space.
Yeah. It's very interesting, just what you just said, and you look at what happened in the US with with how COVID was politicized and all the scapegoats that actually perished. So it's, because we don't have to actually do distancing and wear masks. Oh, because we're giving up our rights. Because, so is it our rights, or is it the health and safety of humanity? So it's very interesting.
So, thank you, Ron. Joanne, you stuck your hand up.
Yeah, I wonder what you think about internet trolls. We live in a digital world, digital era. People like Michael Mellis, I didn't know him at all. I just listened to a artificial intelligence podcast a few weeks ago, and then he was the guest. So it's actually quite mind-blowing world view. But it sounds brutal at the times, but then it does make you think in a similar way as you presented as irony leadership. And I used to like satirical fictions, like what's his name, Salman Rushdie. Yeah, the Satanic Verses, and Dostoevsky, and there was a Brazilian writer from 100 years ago. I forgot his name, Ricardo de Assis. He's also writing brilliantly in a satiric fashion about Brazilian society way back. It's extremely fascinating. So what do you think of internet trolls?
So I think there's a different, getting a troll suggests that you're saying something important, because a troll is if you're having someone who, the only thing worse than being spoken about is not being spoken about, I think is the quote that so someone who's taking the time to go onto your posts and say, oh, you're an idiot, suggests you're doing something of value. At one level, but at the second level, when it becomes mob trolling, where it's people who just go, oh, you have done something that is not pure, and therefore you need to be expelled from good society because you've made done something foolish. That's highly problematic. So there's a difference between, I guess, meaningful trolling, where there's a lot of thought and reflection in posts. So this is the what's the level of thought behind what you're posting before you post, versus this immediacy of, oh, I'm going to throw something out because I need to be viewed in order to live, and that can be really dangerous, because that can be, you haven't put the reflective effort into the cognition, so therefore you can be mob trolled, and being mob trolled is the mob is always out for the scapegoat. And you're always risking being the scapegoat if you do it in an unreflective manner. So both good and bad. That you're saying, you know, if you're putting the reflective work in and you're saying something important, then a troll is quite an interesting thing to have. If you're not putting the reflective work in, it's risking the mob expulsion and the scapegoats. So my favorite troll that ever happened to me, I was doing a piece on the Big Anxiety Festival, which is the biggest anxiety festival in the world, hence the name. And I was doing a piece, it was in Australia, and so we were talking about dicks and dickheads at work. So, which in you know, quite a few people take offense at that kind of language, but you know, dick actually means a rogue, an English rogue. It's the shortening of my name. It had nothing to do with any physical part of human anatomy. Historically, it was just the rogue, Richard as the rogue. And so we looked at Dick as being the nasty rogue and the dickhead as being the foolish rogue. And so we were promoting this. And on someone wrote on the bottom of my LinkedIn, at the bottom of the post I was promoting, he says, it's finally you're talking about something you're qualified to talk about, which I was just think that's a great burn. That's that kind of stuff where there's genuine humor in the trolling. That was something I really appreciate. So yeah, again, elegance and poise and sophistication. Trolling is good. Immediacy, and I'm just vomiting out what I'm feeling here and now in order to try and be funny and be visible. Yeah, really risky.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Claydon. That was a great.
Call me Richard, please. And I'm not. Don't call me doctor. That's only doctor as in the TARDIS, or Richard as in, but not Dr. Claydon. But thank you, Joanne.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Shrikant. I guess that's
yeah,
gone on
we've taken
almost
more
half
than
an
the
hour.
10 minutes. So,
but yeah, I always have time to talk more about this kind of stuff. Really appreciative of an audience that's interested in it as well. So thank you very much for the questions and the engagement.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard.
all right, then. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.